Hello and welcome to 10 Minutes On, a podcast from the Joint Public Issues team. My name's Sienna and I'm a JPIT intern. Joining me is Bishop William Kenney. Bishop William is the titular Bishop of Midica, has a background as a priest and in academia, in addition to working with Caritas Europe, supporting refugees and immigrants. He's a long-term opponent of nuclear armament and a proponent for peace. Recently, he helped to publish a treatise calling for new regulation of weaponized drones, lethal autonomous weapons, and a call to use technology in the service of humanity. Today, we'll be thinking about some of the big questions and development in arms, the overlap with development, and in particular, how we can be approaching these issues as Christians. Bishop William, thank you so much for being here with me today.
It's a pleasure.
To begin our conversation, could you just outline your recent work on a Catholic approach to arms control and disarmament, and also explain why this is an issue that you care about?
The development that has taken place is that we've continued our teaching on this. There is a long tradition in the Catholic Church about armaments, disarmament. If you want to really go back in history, you can go and see the attitude of the Pope to the First World War. There are statements there which would be relevant even today. The reason, of course, is that we believe, as other Christians and other religions do, in the dignity of every woman and man. And therefore, you cannot have that dignity if you're about to kill them. And it really is as blunt as that. We need to realize the inherent dignity which every human being has. And that means that we must move to a world which tries to live at peace rather than with violence with each other. The immediate issues were that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has made various statements, particularly about nuclear armaments, going further, which was always there, but has now explicitly said that even the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. We're not even talking about using them. And so it's in that light that we've again issued a document, partly on the nuclear deterrence, and I'm afraid it has become relevant again because I think some of us are nervous about whether Russia would eventually use nuclear armaments in its ongoing war with the Ukraine. We have also talked about conventional weapons. More people die of conventional weapons than any other form of violence. We see in our own country, we see in many different parts of the world. But we've also tried to educate ourselves because, let's be honest, we as bishops were somewhat ignorant of the use of drones, the use of autonomous weapons. And so this document brings us up to date on a number of these issues.
Yeah, as you say, there have been lots of changes in this area, and so there's a lot of new issues for all of us to be considering. What are your concerns around the trend of global armament, both in terms of nuclear and conventional arms?
In terms of nuclear weapons, I am frightened that the constraints that have been there, and they were good, are now beginning to disappear because of the heightened tension, particularly between the United States of America and some other parts of the world. That has meant that we are frightened there will be an increase in nuclear weapons. I was very disappointed when still in opposition, the present government said that it would automatically renew all of the nuclear armaments in this country and keep them up to date. The cost of that, I hope people realize, is enormous, which would take away resources from things that are much more important to do with the dignity of the human being: health, education, housing, all of the things we hear about. But the cost of keeping nuclear weapons is enormous. The other factor that we are frightened of is the enormous increase even in conventional weapons. Remember, we have, I think the last count was something like 40-odd different sorts of conflicts. The major ones we hear about, particularly those in Gaza and in Ukraine. Even though it was on the BBC this morning, we hear less about an even bigger conflict, which is that in Sudan and South Sudan. And all of these are using weapons, all of these are using resources, which could be used to increase the dignity, as I say, of human beings.
Yeah, it does really feel like we're in a new era. As you were saying, this is not the first time that the Catholic Church has been thinking about these issues. There's a long history with this. But what particular role has the Catholic Church undertaken in arms control?
I think there's two. It uses, as you may be aware, it belongs to the United Nations, not as a full member because the Vatican is not a democracy, as you will be well aware. But it uses it has a very effective and wide-ranging diplomatic body across the world with nuncios, as they're called when they represent the Holy See, but ambassadors basically. And it uses those very much so to put forward its views on armaments. It also does within the various organizations of the United Nations, much to the annoyance of some other countries, of course, but that's one of the areas. Also, the church has become, particularly in more modern times, very active within the range of the international agreements. As I said, it was very active in the creation of the treaty forbidding nuclear armaments, but it has also been active on the limitation of nuclear armaments, trying again and again and again to point out to countries their obligations under treaties which they've already agreed to and now just ignore. We don't believe you can go overnight from the situation we're in to a complete situation of disarmament. That is just nonsense. But we do believe you can do it step by step, and we are encouraging people to do that.
You mentioned earlier, you talked about how as Christians we believe in the inherent dignity of all humans, and that's a core part of the way that you think about and why you engage with these issues. I'd love to think a little bit more in depth why, from a Catholic social teaching perspective, you think that Christians should campaign for peace and arms control, and whether actually there's a uniqueness in any of the Christian perspective that is brought to these issues.
Yeah, uniqueness, no, I wouldn't say. There are other people and people of no faith who would share our beliefs in this. We are in touch with them. We are working with them. So no, unique it is not. I do honestly believe, though, that any group, and Christians should be at the forefront of this, who holds the, let's use a Christian word, holiness of the human being, and the respect that I should show to every woman and man, a girl and boy, that is part of what we are doing. It doesn't matter where they come from, what they're doing, that respect should be there. Catholic social teaching has developed over the last 150 years, particularly, although it's based, you can go back to St. Augustine, you can go back to the Church Fathers and find the roots of it there. It is part of the doctrine of the Church, part of the teaching of the Church. And for good and ill, the Catholic Church has always been a political animal. It hasn't always been for good, let's be quite honest about that. But we try to do our best at the moment to use it to create peace.
That's really interesting. And yeah, I think I've definitely, as someone who actually hasn't engaged a huge amount with Catholic teaching, as someone who's grown up in Protestant traditions, it's something that I've come to, the more that I've learned about, the more that I've seen that there's real richness there's so much overlap, unsurprisingly, but there's also different perspectives and different traditions that are really helpful when thinking about these really complex issues and, the complex world that we live in. You wrote this report on peacemaking, and that's been published, and you've done some interviews in that. But as well as kind of working on peace, you have a background in development.
Yes.
I'd love to think a little bit more about this overlap between disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and achieving development goals. You talk about the need for a global fund.
Yes, we do. Again, an enormous amount of resources are spent on armaments in the world. And those are resources which could be used for much more human activities in healthcare, education, housing, all of the things we talk about, which we think we lack in this country, even though we're the, sixth or seventh richest country in the world. Even so, we still are talking about these sort of things. So that is a big, big point. If the resources put into armaments were put into this, just to look at the illegal arms trade, it, together with human trafficking and drug abuse, they are the three major international crimes which are committed. And our countries are in a position where they could do something about it, not least about money laundering, about the way our banking system is used, all of these sort of things, which, as I say, takes us a long way out of what we're supposed to be speaking about this morning.
Yeah, but it's also interlinked. As I've learned more about this particular issue, I just have been astonished by how much money is spent on armament. It's particularly difficult to think about when we know that development spending in the UK is being cut. And
yes,
the Labour government says that they might increase it and that they would like to when certain economic conditions that have not been specified are met. And when you look at when you contrast the two figures, it's really depressing.
That's right. I find it, as I say, I find it almost cynical that there's no problem about finding a fund to update our nuclear deterrent, but we have problem finding funding to feed people.
Yeah. Well, we're coming towards the end, but with all of these really big new challenges and kind of moving into some ways a more bleak picture around disarmament, what brings you hope and what keeps you motivated in continuing to work for peace?
Oh, what gives me hope is people, without any doubt whatsoever. Most people are basically good. Most people basically want to help their neighbours. You see it in all the small ways. I mean, the pandemic was a horrible situation, but what amazed me was the way so many people helped each other, the way people were keeping an eye on older neighbours, the way people would do shopping for an older person, the way people would take a family that suddenly needed medical care to hospital. They didn't even have to be asked, they just did it. And that gives me enormous hope. So that's one thing. The other is that we perhaps are getting more knowledge. Drones, of course, have very useful it's a technology. The technology can be used for good, and therefore we're not going to abolish the technology, but it can't be denied that it is providing us with comparatively cheap weapons, which are being used as we speak in the Ukraine, in Russia, in Israel and Palestine, and in other parts of the world. All of these things need control. We've done a lot to control, say, chemical warfare, mines, other forms of armaments. All of those things took a lot of work. They're not perfect, but they have reduced to some extent. We're going to have to do the same sort of thing with drones and the way they are used. What we will do in the future, I don't know at the moment. The Catholic Church in England and Wales, with cooperation from our brothers and sisters in Scotland, will be doing more about this. This is not the end of the road. It is only the beginning.
Well, thank you. And we'll keep an eye out for what you get up to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating and actually in some ways hopeful conversation. If you're listening and you want to find out more about the Future of Arms project, go to jpit.uk/future-of-arms. You can also find the briefing that Bishop William worked on, called to be peacemakers, linked in our show notes. Follow us on social media for updates and to get prayers and actions that accompany these resources. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it around. Thank you so much for listening.